Hello everyone, I'm Russ Lowenthal with the Database Security Product Management team here at Oracle, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about integrating Oracle databases with Microsoft Active Directory. And specifically what we're talking about today is a feature that we introduced in Database 18C called Centrally Managed Users. This is a feature of the database. It's not an extra cost option. It is included with your Enterprise Edition database. And basically what Centrally Managed Users, or CMU, allows you to do is it allows you to take database schemas and map those schemas to users or groups in Active Directory so that when someone tries to log into the database, they log in with their Active Directory credentials. When someone changes their password, that happens in Active Directory. If they leave the organization, they're removed from Active Directory or disabled in Active Directory. Just like we do with database schemas, we also map database roles to Active Directory groups so that if you've done everything properly, all user administration, granting privileges, revoking privileges, changing passwords, adding, removing users, all can be done within Active Directory. Now, the idea of directory integration isn't new to the Oracle database. We first introduced this back in Oracle 8i. That's not a typo. 8i, not 18i, 8i. And we called that feature Enterprise User Security. And Enterprise User Security connects an Oracle database to the Oracle directory. That could be Internet Directory or Unified Directory. Much like Centrally Managed Users, Enterprise User Security allows you to map database schemas and roles to directory groups and users. Enterprise User Security is still here. It's not going away. In fact, we actively develop Enterprise User Security. We just released new features for it with Database 21C. But now you have a choice. You can either do Centrally Managed Users, database to Active Directory, or you can do Enterprise User Security, database to Oracle Directory. Now, I'd mentioned that we're going to map database schemas to Active Directory users. We have two options for how we do this mapping. We can use what's called a dedicated database schema, and this is one where you have the schema in the database with a one-to-one relationship between the database and Active Directory. So as you can see here, I'm going to create a database schema called Bob, identified globally as C and equal Bob, OU equal users, and you see the rest. In other words, Bob in the database equals Bob in Active Directory. The other choice is a shared database schema. And with the shared database schema, I map the database schema to a group in Active Directory, and all members of that group, when they log into the database, they're connected to this schema. The syntax for that, as you can see here, create user, LDAP user, identified globally as, and in this case, the distinguished name for my group is CN equal HR-rep, OU equal groups, DC equal company, DC equal com. Now, in addition to doing schema mappings, we also do role mappings, and here it's always one-to-one. Global database role maps to one and only one Active Directory group, and the syntax for that might be something like create role HR manager, identified globally as CN equal HR-manager, OU equal groups, DC equal company, DC equal com. In the lower right-hand corner, you get an idea what my Active Directory looks like. It's a very simple one. I've only got 4 users in it, Suzanne, Diana, Bob, Venkat, and I've got 2 groups, HR Rep, which has Susan and Diana, and I have another group, HR Manager, which is just Susan. Let's look what happens when Susan tries to log in. So Susan's going to go to the database using her normal database client. Toad, SQL Developer, SQL Plus, doesn't matter. In this case, SQL Plus. And Susan's going to connect into a pluggable database, and she's going to enter her Active Directory password. She's connected. User experience is the same so far as anything else. But when Susan does a show user, we can see that because she was mapped as a shared schema, her user is LDAP user. And when Susan checks to see what her authenticated identity is using syscontext, we can see that it is company, that's the domain name in this case, /Susan. And when Susan checks her enterprise identity, we can see that it is her distinguished name, what's actually in Active Directory, CN equals Susan in the container users for the company.com domain. And finally, when Susan checks to see what role she has enabled, because she was a member of the HR-manager group, which is mapped to the HR manager role in the database, we see that her session roles show she has HR manager. Now, what I just showed you was Susan logging in using username and password. But the database supports many authentication methods. It can use operating system authentication, username and password, Kerberos, certificate, or radius. But only 3 of these work with centrally managed users, and that's password, Kerberos, and certificate. For password authentication to work with centrally managed users, you must install Oracle Password Filter for Active Directory on the domain controller. This is basically a DLL that loads on the domain controller that uses Microsoft's notification package API so that when a password is changed by the domain controller, the filter will create a Oracle compatible hash, SHA-512 usually, and store that in an attribute in Active Directory so that the database can retrieve it. Then when a user tries to authenticate, the user's session will connect to the database, present their credentials, the database will go out to Active Directory, retrieve the appropriate hash, and compare the hash it retrieved from Active Directory with the hash that was presented from the user. So one way to authenticate with centrally managed users is password authentication, but probably the most common way to integrate with centrally managed users is Kerberos authentication. And you'll find that Kerberos authentication tends to make your domain administrators a lot more happy. Kerberos is a well-known authentication scheme. It's already known and approved by most security schemes. Your domain admins are happier because they don't have to install DLLs or make changes to Active Directory. And Kerberos works with almost all Oracle clients, SQL Developer, SQL Plus, Toad. Kerberos is ubiquitous throughout the industry. You can mix and match. You can have some users that authenticate with username and password and some that authenticate with Kerberos, even the same user. For example, if we go back to Susan and we connect again with username and password, when we look at Susan's authentication mechanism, we can see password_global. Global indicates centrally managed users or directory-based users, and password, she authenticated with a password. Now, if we check, Susan just happens to have a Kerberos ticket. And if you've ever used OKList, you'll forgive me, OKList prints out a really long screen return. I cut that back to just the essentials because I wanted everything to fit on this screen. But we can see she has a Kerberos principal, susan@company.com, and she has a ticket for the Oracle service, oracle@dbserver1.company.com, @company.com, just what's in the ticket. Now, Susan connects /@ PDB1. The /@ indicates external authentication, in this case using Kerberos. And now when we check our authentication mechanism, we see Kerberos_global. So the same user can be authenticated multiple different ways depending upon what your configuration is. Speaking of configuration, let's take a look at how to configure centrally managed users. If you're using Kerberos authentication, you should set that up first. Get Kerberos working before you ever begin with CMU. If you're using password authentication before you start configuring CMU, install the password filter on your domain controllers so that you can begin to capture those password changes and have verifiers in your domain that CMU can use to authenticate for the database. Once you've got that done, now you're going to create an Oracle Service account in Active Directory. This is just a normal AD user, no special privileges other than if you're using password authentication, this user must have privileges to read the password verifiers that you're creating. Next thing you're going to do is get Microsoft's TLS certificate. This is the certificate that Active Directory uses for LDAP over TLS. Port 636 normally. So you'll need to get that certificate, and then you take that certificate and the credentials you got for that service account and you add them to an Oracle wallet. And this Oracle wallet is what the database is going to use to connect into Active Directory. Next, you're going to create a DSI.ORA. This is just the file that tells the database where Active Directory is, what the IP address and ports are, for example. And then you're going to create your users and roles just the way we did before we took a look at Susan's login. Now, a closer look at CMU Wallet. Again, your wallet must contain at least 4 things. It needs to have the distinguished name of the service account you created in Active Directory. It needs to have that user's password. It needs to have the username, the common name for that user. It also must have that trusted certificate that lets the database talk over TLS to Active Directory. The DSI.ORA file just contains a couple of lines. The first line that has to be in there is DSI_directory_servers, and this is just going to contain a comma-separated list of domain controllers along with their ports. This can either be host name, the way you see here, ad.company.com, or it can be an IP address. In this case, 389 is the unencrypted port, 636 is the TLS encrypted port, and it'll almost always be 389 and 636. Now you're on to working with your users and roles, and this is where you'll spend the majority of your time as you're setting up Active Directory authentication, because this is really where the end user stuff comes into play. Now, same scenario we've been using all along. We've run these 3 commands. We've created a user Bob, we've created a user LDAP user, and we've created a role HR manager. Same Active Directory configuration I talked about before. We have users in 2 groups. Which of my 4 users can log into the database? Well, in this case, Bob, because Bob was created as a dedicated schema, and Susan and Diana, because they were created as their group, HR rep, was created as a shared schema. And if we look at those schema mappings, we can see that, we'll remember that Bob was mapped to Bob because it's dedicated, whereas Susan and Diana are mapped to LDAP users. And for roles, well, Bob and Diana have no roles that they got through centrally managed users. There may have been roles that were granted directly to their schema, but nothing through centrally managed users. Susan, because she's a member of the HR manager group, which was mapped to the HR manager role, has the HR manager role. Let's take a little look at what you can do to manage and troubleshoot centrally managed users. So we'll look at issues and troubleshooting, and before we get into that, I just want to give a quick thank you to Oracle Ace Simon Payne. Simon is a consultant with Pythian, and he's done several centrally managed user implementations at large customers. And Simon was kind enough to spend some time with me talking about what are the typical issues he's seen in his practice and how does he go about troubleshooting these. So what we're going to cover next is both from the standpoint of the development team and also from a person who actually implements this stuff. And there's a set of tools that you're going to have in your toolbox for this. One of your best tools for troubleshooting problems with centrally managed users is connection tracing. You're going to set an event, trace GDSI, and that event is going to cause additional information about the LDAP calls that the database is making to Active Directory to be put into trace files. Another tool you're going to use is MakeStore, MKStore. This is how you can look into your wallet and see, what does the wallet have for the username? What does the wallet have for the distinguished name? What does the wallet have for the password? I cannot tell you how many times I have worked with support escalations where the customer was positive that they had the distinguished name right in the wallet, and it wasn't right. It was 1 character off, or an O became a 0, or something like that. Another tool that is going to be valuable for you to use is PowerShell. PowerShell, assuming you're attached to the domain, lets you print out, what are the properties of my Active Directory user? What are their distinguished name? Do they have a password attribute? That's that ORCL common attribute where we store our verifiers. What groups are they a member of? I can also use PowerShell to check the registry on the domain controller. Do I have a notification package installed? That's where that password filter is, a notification package. If it's not installed, well then of course password authentication is never going to work. Next tool we'll look at is the LDAP bind command. This is how you test your TLS connection between the database server and Active Directory. And so you're going to run LDAP bind, give it the host name, the port 636, your authentication method, which is -U2, that means only the server presents the certificate, the wallet location and password, and then the entries that you got from your MakeStore commands, that tool we looked at on the last slide. What is the distinguished name of the service account? What is the password of the service account? If this doesn't return a bind successful, you need to stop right here because the database isn't the problem. It's somewhere in your connection between the database and Active Directory. It's unlikely any of you are still running 18C. 18C is already out of support and it was just an innovation release. But when we first introduced centrally managed users in 18C, we required a special type of bind to Active Directory called a SASL bind. You had to enable this on Active Directory. In 19C, we recognized that that was a little bit of an issue for a lot of our customers, and we'll try a SASL bind because it's more secure. But if your Active Directory isn't set up for that, we'll just retry with a standard LDAP bind. All right. There's some of your tools. Let's take a look at some of the error conditions that you're likely to encounter. One thing you may get is invalid username and passwords. Generic error just means something went wrong. A lot of times, it's just you didn't put in the right password, especially if it's a really complex password. I've seen so many typos there. If you're using Kerberos, maybe you have an invalid Kerberos ticket. Maybe the account is locked in Active Directory. The password's expired. Database knows that and won't let you log in as that user. Maybe the database can't connect to Active Directory. Go back and check your LDAP bind again. But this is one thing you may see. Another issue you're likely to run into is the DSI.aura that you think you're using may not be the one you're actually using. The default location for the DSI.aura is Oracle Base Admin and then database unique name PDB GUID wallet. Long string, not Oracle Home Network Admin, which is where a lot of us are used to looking for our network files. In Database 21C, we introduced a new database property that allows you to override that default CMU wallet, and we've already backported that to 19C. So if you find that you're having problems remembering where your DSI.aura is, set that CMU wallet property and put it wherever you want. I like Oracle Home Network Admin. Another error condition you may run into is an Aura 28276. This is saying that the database is not able to find a password verifier that matches the user you gave. So there was no Kerberos ticket and there was no password verifier. Now this could be caused by a number of things. If the user who's trying to log in hasn't changed their password since the filter was installed, then their password change never ran through the filter, the Oracle Database password verifiers were never generated and never stored in that special attribute in Active Directory. It could be that you didn't add the user to one of the Active Directory groups that tells the password filter to do its thing, because we don't create password verifiers for every user in Active Directory. We only create them for users that you put into a group that says something like Aura_VFR_12C. That's your SHA-512 hash is the one that hopefully you're mostly using, or Aura_verifier_11G. That's your old SHA-1 hashes, or hopefully you're not using this Aura_VFR_MD5, which is a very old MD5 hash. Another thing you may run into with Active Directory, you have multiple domain controllers, and when a user changes their password change is handled by whatever domain controller happens to be closest to them. And closest can not always be a physical thing, it can sometimes be a timing thing. If you didn't install the password filter on all domain controllers, then there's a chance your user has changed their password on a domain controller that didn't have the password filter, and so their password wasn't updated in that special attribute. All right. Another error condition you may run into is an Aura 28036. This one is really rare, but it happens with shared schemas, and it's only shared schemas where you have one database or one Active Directory user who is members of two groups that have been mapped to database schema. So that when the database looks for Susan, it finds, well, Susan could be LDAP user, or she could be HR user. Maybe there's a different group called HR user. Dedicated schema won't matter, because if there's a dedicated schema mapping and a shared schema mapping, we always use the dedicated schema mapping. But if it's a shared schema mapping and that user can map to two different schemas, then you'll get the 28036 error. Another error you may run into is an Aura 28043. This just means that the credentials in the database wallet no longer work to connect to Active Directory. Someone could have changed the password for that service account, the password could have expired without being changed, or perhaps you entered the wrong DN or password into that wallet. If it's a new setup, I would go for the latter one. Maybe you entered the wrong password. But if it's an older setup that was working and just suddenly stopped working, you start seeing these errors. It usually just means the password's expired. Another one you may run into, Aura 28030. TLS connection from the database to Active Directory has failed. This a lot of times happens because you'll put into your DSI.aura our host name for the Active Directory server and 389, that's the standard LDAP port, and forget to put in that second port. So it's got to be LDAP port and LDAP-S port. There's one more error condition, and that is credential retrieval failed, or a 12638. This is not a CMU error, this is a Kerberos error, and my recommendation is if you see this, forget about CMU, troubleshoot this purely as a Kerberos error, because it's much easier to work with it just as an external user where you have less moving parts to work with. All right, that's it for centrally managed users. What I hope you've taken away from today. CMU makes it easy to integrate Oracle database users and roles with Active Directory. You can choose to authenticate with Kerberos, password, or certificate. Kerberos is usually what you're going to use. And that once CMU is configured, if you remember what we talked about with roles and dedicated schemas and shared schemas, you can offload all user management onto the Active Directory work and free up your time for more important things. If you'd like to learn more about database security, I encourage you to visit Oracle Live Labs. We have hands-on sessions out there where you can practice with things like advanced security and database vault and key vault and data masking and subsetting and audit vault and firewall, all kinds of stuff out there. So Go Live Labs DBSec, bit.ly/Go Live Labs DBSec. The other thing I'd like to make sure you know about is that on the second Wednesday of each month, the product management team holds office hours for our customers. You can subscribe to be notified of those at bit.ly/AskTomDBSec. Join us. It's a short hour. We do 2 sessions each day, so you can find a time that works for you. We talk about what's new in database security. There's always some technical topic. And if you're looking for technical information on stuff that's been around for a while, check our archives. We've done sessions on everything from centrally managed users to Kerberos authentication to data safe, you name it. All right, never stop learning. There's a ton more. We have Oracle Technology Network, oracle.com. We have an electronic book. But again, take a look at the bit.ly/Go Live Labs DBSec, and I hope to see you sometime. Thanks.